professor of developmental cognitive neuroscience at the University of Copenhagen, where she directs the Center for Early Childhood Cognition. On a more personal note, I've personally followed and admired Dr. Southgate's work since I was an undergraduate student over 10 years ago. So I feel really lucky to be able to introduce her to all of you and her talk on uniquely infant social intelligence. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Southgate.
Sorry, it says that I can't share my screen. It says that the host disabled participant screen sharing. Ah, there we go. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. All right, thank you so much for inviting me. I've never given a talk in a workshop on robots or social intelligence like this, so this is a first for me. Yeah, so my name is Victoria Southgate. I'm a developmental psychologist from the University of Copenhagen. And I study social cognition in babies, and in particular, how infants are able to manage and switch between representations of the self and of other. And so what I'm going to talk about in my short time today is a theory of development in which early social cognition is different from adult social cognition. And I'll show you some data to try to convince you that this is the case. Okay, so achieving a balance between the relative influence of self and other is clearly central to successful social cognition. And this is especially challenging when the self and the other may hold conflicting content. For example, when I see something that you can't. And this is especially the case in communication, where we're constantly having to consider common ground or privileged ground when we design our utterances or when we try to make sense of others' utterances. And there are thought to be at least two separable dimensions underpinning this ability to control self-other representations. One is the actual sort of cognitive control aspect of it, and the other is the relative attentional focus that we give to the self or other that can vary a lot individually. And we know that achieving this balance is not easy. So both adults and children show an egocentric bias in their responding. Why this is an interesting question. Not going to talk about that today. And we know that overriding this bias is effortful. So if you tax working memory or executive functions, then this bias becomes more pronounced. And so just to show you what I mean, here's an example of the egocentric bias at play. So this is the so-called director task, where some objects are not visible to the director, who is asking the participant to move objects around a grid. So the director might say, move the small candle to the right, but the smallest candle for the director is the medium-sized candle for the participant. And so they have to resist interpreting the communication based on their own perspective. And various studies show that initially participants' eyes land on the egocentrically compatible object, and they have to correct this and respond appropriately. And we know that children are slower to correct egocentric responses than adults, suggesting that it's more effortful for children to do this. And we can trace this idea of egocentric cognition back to Piaget, who, based on his tasks with young children, like the Three Mountains task depicted here, he wrote that initially the child sees everything from his own point of view. It is because he believes all the world to think like himself. He has not yet discovered the multiplicity of possible perspectives and remains blind to all but his own, as if that were the only possible one. And because Piaget was a stage theorist who argued that children needed to develop out of this stage in order to lose their predominant egocentrism, the implication was that egocentrism is the point of departure for cognitive development. And thus, we should expect that infants would be, in a sense, even more egocentric than preschoolers. And one of the most well-known examples of apparent egocentrism in young children is their response on the so-called false belief tasks. This is a task testing children's understanding of mental states. And you basically tell, for those of you who don't know, you basically tell a story to the child where there is one character, we'll call her Sally, who puts her ball in a basket. She goes away, and while she's away, another character moves Sally's ball from the basket to a box, and then Sally comes back and you ask the child, where will she search for her ball? And robustly, 3-year-olds will tell you that Sally will search for her ball in the box where it now is, as if they haven't taken into account that she didn't see this and she should still think her ball is in the basket, whereas 4-year-olds will answer that she will look where she should think it is rather than where the child themselves knows it to be. And there's a correlation between children's cognitive control skills and their success on this task. And so the standard explanation is that in order to pass this task, children need to develop sufficient cognitive control to suppress their egocentric representation of the ball's actual location and be able to base their expectations on the other's representation. And this was the story for a long time, and to some extent still is. But then came a body of work suggesting that babies, even as young as 6 months, were behaving as if they were able to ignore their own perspective and predict what someone else would do based on what that person had seen or not. So this is an example from my own work where we presented 6-month-old babies with 2 trial types while we measured their brain activity. So this was an EEG study, and we measured EEG alpha suppression, which is a marker of action prediction. So we basically wanted a nonverbal marker of action prediction to ask if babies would correctly anticipate when someone would reach for a box if she thought the ball was inside, but would she not reach if she didn't think the ball was inside. And in every trial, the baby held the opposite knowledge from the participant, sorry, from the agent. So when the agent thought the ball was inside, the baby had seen that the ball had left, and vice versa. When the agent thought the ball had left, the baby had seen the ball come back. And what we found here was that 6-month-olds correctly predicted that the agent would reach for the ball when she thought the ball was inside, even when the baby themselves should have known that the ball was not inside. So if egocentrism is the starting point for cognitive development, then the question is, how do babies successfully ignore their own perspective on these kind of nonverbal tasks? And so there are various explanations, but common to most of these is that it is the nature of the nonverbal task that kind of circumvents the need to manage conflicting representations. And in this way, infant success on these tasks is independent of things like cognitive control, because either because the task doesn't require an explicit response, or because there's no verbal question, which means that processing of others' mental states can remain modular and independent of, say, what you know. But in fact, when these infant nonverbal tasks are given to adults, then we see that performance is not independent from our kind of capacity limited cognitive resources. So if adults take part in a nonverbal task originally designed for babies, measuring where they expect someone with a conflicting perspective to look for their object, so there are no language or explicit response requirements here, then performance worsens under cognitive load. So with no additional load, adults can correctly gaze towards a box where the other thinks the object should be, even when the adult themselves knows it to be somewhere else. But under conditions of cognitive load, their ability to do this is reduced. And so this indicates that the nonverbal tasks still entail additional cognitive resources that infants are unlikely to have available to them. So because of this, I propose an alternative explanation, which is not about the nature of the tasks, but rather about the unique nature of infant cognition. So I propose that infants can track others' perspectives without interference from the self perspective, and thus without the need for much cognitive control because of 2 features of cognition, one that is developmental and one that's not. So the non-developmental feature, which is present throughout life, or seems to be, is that we tend to spontaneously encode others' perspectives, regardless of whether we need to. And sometimes, most likely because of shared mechanisms underpinning representations of self and other, we can see interference of this other encoding in our first-person representation. So one example of this is this infamous Smurf task by Kovacs and colleagues, where they showed that when adult participants when the task is to press a button, as soon as they detect a ball revealed at this outcome phase, that they're faster to do this when the agent in the scene, the Smurf, erroneously or falsely believes that the ball should be there, even though the participant should know that and does know that it's not there. And so this suggests that they've sort of spontaneously encoded the agent's perspective and that it is contributing to their own representation. And in an infant version with 7-month-old babies, infants look longer when the ball is revealed to be absent at the end in the outcome phase, even when babies themselves have seen the ball leave and so should expect it not to be there if another agent, the Smurf, falsely believes that the ball is there, suggesting that also for babies, they have spontaneously encoded the scene according to the agent or from the agent's perspective, and that this influences their own first-person representation. And while this effect is often termed interference, we and others have argued that it is likely that this tendency for allocentric encoding and to spontaneously encode things from others' perspectives that enables us to rapidly and sometimes automatically align our attention with others, facilitating things like gaze following, joint action, perspective taking, communication. But while allocentric influence can be seen throughout the lifespan, we also argue that it is likely to have particular benefits in early development. And this is because, especially in the first year, infants' abilities to act on the world themselves are very limited. So in part due to motor immaturity. And the main challenge of infancy is learning a vast amount of information, and much of it is going to be from those around you. So conditions that allow infants to easily align attention with others would have particular adaptive value early in life. And then the second feature that I think minimizes interference between self and other perspectives is an absence or an initial absence of self-representation in babies. So there's fairly compelling evidence for a late development of self-representation. So there have always been many different conceptualizations of what self-representation is, and levels of distinction between different kinds of self. But there is a general convergence in the literature that there is an objective self-representation that we achieve, which allows us to go beyond a subjective feeling of being an agent in action to being able to see ourselves as distinct from others, in relation to others, in comparison with others, and which does things like motivates us to align with others, allows us to have autobiographical memories, etc. And this objective self-representation appears to be reflected in the capacity for mirror self-recognition, which emerges somewhere between 18 and 24 months of age. And together, this is what I claim, these two features, a tendency to spontaneously encode others' attention, coupled with an initial absence of self-representation, leads to an allocentric bias, where infants preferentially encode the targets of others' attention. And so the need for cognitive control is markedly reduced because in the absence of a distinct self-representation, infants do not experience a conflict between self and other. And so they can anticipate what someone else will do without interference from what they have seen themselves. And so this is why we say that infants have an allocentric bias. They're not just experiencing interference with their own first-person representation, because in a sense, they just don't have a first-person representation, or strictly speaking, their first-person representation is generated based on encoding the world through other people. So this is an overview of the account that I proposed, where an initial absence of self-representation leads to an allocentric bias. And once self-representation emerges, infants are faced with the challenge, especially when the perspectives conflict, of managing and selecting between the self and the other. And for this, they need sufficiently mature cognitive control resources. So the hypothesis makes at least three main predictions. The first is that there will be an initial bias to encode information that is witnessed together with other people over information that the baby witnesses by themselves. The second is that this bias should decline, at least in line with the emergence of self-representation. So it won't be there for long. And the third is that as self-representation emerges, infants should begin to experience a conflict when when the self and the other perspective are diverged. So I'm going to show you data that suggest or in some way support each of these contentions. Okay, so just to be clear what I mean by an allocentric bias, we use this term allocentric bias to describe the cognition of infants as anchored to the locus of attention of others. So whatever the other is attending to becomes prioritized for the baby and preferentially encoded and retained. So in this scene here, the event, the ball and its location that the agent is attending to receives relatively more attention and encoding than the same event in the agent's absence. So the first prediction we made was that infants would have a better memory for an object at a location where it was observed or co-witnessed by another agent than a location where only the baby witnessed the object by themselves. And importantly, this hypothesis doesn't deny babies' object permanence. We know they have object permanence, but it does say that when there's a conflict between perspectives, when the same object must be represented in two different ways, that infants would prioritize the maintenance of representations that are derived from attending to the targets of others' attention. So in this first study, which was run or led by my graduate student, Velisa Mania, we asked whether 8-month-old infants might misremember the location of an object if its hiding there was co-witnessed. So this was a pre-registered looking time study. So we measure looking time as an indicator of what infants expect and expect them to look longer at things that surprise them or that they didn't expect. And our main interest here was in whether the same object hiding would be differently encoded by the baby, depending on whether it was co-witnessed by another agent or alone by the baby. And this ended up being a very large study with multiple conditions, but today, so I'm only going to present data from the main pre-registered conditions. So in the non-social condition, we simply test for memory of an object. So infants see an object move behind one occluder and then behind a second occluder. And we expect them to remember the last location where they have seen the object. And so to look longer, an outcome where the object is revealed to be absent at this last location than at the first location. Okay, so we expect longer looking to the incongruent outcome where the object is revealed to be absent at this last location that the baby has seen the object. And then to test whether infants might misremember the location of an object at a co-witness location, in the co-witness first condition, we simply add an agent who observes the first hiding of the object. And then this agent disappears and the infant sees the second hiding or the object traverse to the second location as in the non-social condition. So even though infants have seen exactly the same second transition of the object, we predicted that infants would have a stronger representation of the object at the first location than the second. Or the actual location where the infant has last seen it. And so we pre-registered the prediction that in this case, they would look longer at the congruent outcome. So this is the data from the non-social conditions. We actually had 2 non-social conditions. I'm not going to go into the details, but you can see that in both conditions, we see longer looking to the revealed when the object is revealed to be absent at the last location, which is what we expected. So 8-month-olds are able to remember the last location that they saw this object. So let me show you the co-witness first condition because it is exactly the same, except now there's an agent. So the babies see the event like this. An agent appears and watches together with the baby the first disappearance. She goes away and then the object traverses to the second location. Okay. And what we predicted here was that babies would now look longer to the revealed absence of the object at the congruent location, to the congruent outcome than the incongruent. And so this is the data for this condition. And what you can see is exactly what we predicted. This is the purple line. So the object disappearance at the first location is more surprising to babies than the object disappearance at the actual location. So this is in accord with our prediction that infants have a stronger representation of the object when they co-witnessed it. We also ran a condition in which the agent co-witnesses both object hidings. And here we predicted that as with the non-social conditions, this is the bottom one here, as with the non-social conditions, the infant should now remember the final location because it is here that both they and the agent have last seen the object. So we expected that infants would look longer at the missing object at its final location again. And so here you can see this blue line, and unfortunately what you can see is that we basically have a null result in this condition. So no evidence that they remember the ball differentially at either location. I don't have time to go into the details here. We ran some follow-up conditions to probe this, and we think the explanation is rather boring, and I'm happy to talk about it later. But for now, we take our finding that infants look longer to the missing object at the first location in the co-witness first condition as evidence that they misremember the object at this location, even though they've subsequently seen it move to the second location. And we have evidence that they perfectly well track the object to the second location, so we coded all of their eye movements. So it's not about how much attention they pay to the second event. Okay, And most recently, we ran 2 of the conditions with 12-month-olds. So the crucial co-witness first condition and a co-witness last condition where the agent and the baby last see the object in the second location. And while we still have some babies that we need to test in one of the conditions here, what we can see is that with 12-month-olds, while they look significantly longer to the missing ball at the last location, which is where we had the null result with the 8-month-olds, which is what we expect. So they should remember the last location when both they and the agent have seen it there. We don't seem to see the same expectation that the object is in the first location in the co-witness condition. So we don't also see that they remember it in the last location. So it's a sort of a flat line, a null result. But we take this, or our tentative interpretation is that this alpha-centric bias is beginning to wane once infants get to 12 months. Okay, so then in another study led by my then postdoc, Dora Kompish, we approached the same question in a slightly different way by asking whether infants might misremember the object kind rather than object location. So if someone else had seen a duck put in a box, but then the duck was switched to a shoe in that person's absence, would infants themselves have a stronger encoding that there was a duck in the box, because this was the co-witnessed event, than a shoe in the box that they've just seen put in the box? And so we took our inspiration here from the work of Forgatch and colleagues, who had shown already an alpha-centric effect using the semantic mismatch N400 ERP component. So in this study, the semantic mismatch N400 is basically an enhancement of the N400 when there's a mismatch. So you see a shoe and someone names it a duck, you would see an enhancement in this N400. So what they did in this study was there's an agent who sees, say, a car in front of them, and then she goes away, and while she's away, the car is replaced by a shoe. And then she comes back, she can't see the shoe, but the shoe is labeled a shoe. So this is consistent for the baby. It shouldn't elicit the N400, except if the baby is in some way, or has in some way encoded this event from the other's perspective. And so what they showed is that indeed you see an enhancement in the N400 when a shoe is labeled a shoe, if the other person thinks that the shoe is not there, or the other person thinks it's something else. So we use this N400 to ask whether 14-month-olds misremember the object kind. And so rather than labeling a visible object, we labeled a hidden object to test whether infants' memory for what is in the box is more influenced by what they co-witnessed with another person, or what they have most recently seen themselves in the box. So a trial looks like this. Infants watch as an agent puts a familiar object, like a duck, in a box, and then the agent disappears, and a hand comes in and takes out the first object and replaces it with another familiar object, in this case, a shoe. And then a different hand from the opposite side points at the box and infants hear a label. And the label is always incorrect. Is always incorrect for the baby, but on 50% of trials, it matches the first co-witnessed object. So what we reasoned was, if babies have a stronger memory of the co-witnessed object than the actual object, then we would predict a smaller N400 when the label matches the co-witnessed object than when it doesn't match either object. So in this example, a smaller N400 when they hear that it's a duck than a label that is incorrect for both, like banana. And so what you can see here is the data from 34 babies who gave us enough trials. And as you can see, we do indeed see a smaller N400 when the label is incongruent with the first co-witnessed object, even when that label is incongruent with what the infant has just seen put in the box. So again, we interpret this data as suggesting that what infants remember to be in the box is more strongly influenced by what they saw together with someone else than what they saw by themselves. Okay, and the third main prediction from the model is that the need for self-other control will emerge only once infants have a distinct self-representation that could conflict with their other derived representation. And if so, this would imply that before infants have self-representation, they could manage to track others' perspectives without experiencing or needing to manage conflict. So this study was led by my postdoc, Emanuela Jung, and in it we asked whether experience of perspective conflict is modulated by self-representation at 18 months. And we test 18 months because at this age, roughly 50% of infants pass the mirror self-recognition task. So Based on work indicating greater pupil dilation with cognitive load, we reasoned that an event high in perspective conflict would elicit greater pupil dilation than an event lower in perspective conflict. And informed by studies with adults, we made two perspective conflict conditions: a high conflict condition in which an agent watches as the ball jumps into the left-hand box, and then the agent disappears, after which the ball jumps into the right-hand box. And we call this high conflict because the observer knows the real location of the object, and this should conflict with where the agent thinks the ball is. And then in the low conflict condition, the agent again watches the ball jump into the left-hand box, but after she disappears, the ball bounces out of the scene altogether. So although the observer still has a conflicting representation because they know the object is no longer in the first box, the idea is that because they don't know exactly where it is now, this less specific representation requires less inhibition. And in adults, it tends to only be in this high conflict condition where there is a demand for inhibition. So we pre-registered the prediction that once infants evidence self-representation, as indexed by the mirror self-recognition, by their ability to pass the mirror self-recognition task, they should experience a conflict between the self and the other perspective. And this will be particularly evident on high conflict trials in greater pupil dilation compared with the lower conflict trials and compared with infants who do not show self-representation. So as well as the eye tracking data that we collected, the infants also did the mirror self-recognition study where we identified 25 recognizers and 25 non-recognizers. We also did the early childhood inhibitory touchscreen task to get a measure of each child's capacity for inhibition. And we did this because we made a bunch of other predictions that I don't have time to talk about today, but also because we wanted to know whether there was something independent of mirror self-recognition that divided these groups. Just to say that it doesn't. So they're equally good at the ESIT task. So as I said, we pre-registered the prediction that once infants evidence self-representation by passing the mirror self-recognition task, they should experience a conflict between the self and the other perspective. And this would be particularly evident on high conflict trials in greater pupil dilation compared with the lower conflict trials and compared to babies who don't pass the mirror self-representation task. And because we didn't know at what point one might experience conflict between the self and the other perspective, we pre-registered 3 potential windows: one where the ball begins to move after the agent has left the scene, one where the agent returns to the scene, and a final one where the infants could expect the agent to act. So here what you can see are the pupil data plotted across the duration of the trial for both mirror recognizers and mirror non-recognizers, and with our 3 pre-registered time windows marked. And so we subjected this data to a functional data analysis to identify any time points where there was a significant difference between the two groups. So the line here indicates the difference between groups plotted as the t-statistic at each time point. And this analysis told us that there were with greater pupil dilation in mirror recognizers than mirror non-recognizers at 2 time points. One during our 3rd pre-registered time window where the infants could expect the agent to reach for one of the boxes. And then there was also a 2nd time point before our pre-registered time windows when the agent is about to disappear after the onset, after the object is hidden for the first time. So I'm not going to talk about this second effect today, but the first effect to us suggests that recognizers experience greater conflict as indexed by their pupil dilation when they are presumably trying to anticipate where the agent will reach for the ball. And when we plotted the data separately for the high and low demand conditions, although there's a similar pattern in both in the 3rd time window, it looked like a more pronounced difference between recognizers and non-recognizers in the high demand condition. And indeed, when we subjected the data to functional data analysis, this was the case. So here you can see that there is a significant difference between recognizers and non-recognizers in this 3rd time window on the high demand conflict trials, but no significant difference between the two groups on the low conflict trials. And so this supports our prediction that the difference between recognizers and non-recognizers in their experience of conflict between self and other would be mainly visible in situations high in perspective conflict, as it is in adults. Okay. So we show, or we think we've shown, that self-representation is associated with greater pupil dilation at a point where infants could expect the agent to act, which we interpret as indicating that self-representation brings with it conflict when the self and the other perspectives diverge. And we take this data to imply that an absence of self-representation is beneficial to babies in reducing what would otherwise be, and we show is, for the 18-month-olds who have self-representation, a conflict-inducing situation that they would need sufficient cognitive control to deal with. And before I end, I just want to mention a couple of other things that I think may be important for this initial absence of self-representation and for this early outer-centric bias, both of which I think may be fostered by the nature of early parent-child interactions. So the first is oxytocin. So oxytocin is a neuropeptide that has many functions and effects, but one of its effects is that it somehow orients attention away from the self and enhances outer-centric interference. And we know that young babies have much higher baseline levels of oxytocin than older children, most likely because they spend a lot of time in close physical proximity with their caregivers, which regulates and induces oxytocin. And we also know from this data that as oxytocin levels decline in the second year of life, so too does infants' attention to the eyes. So I became very interested in whether high baseline levels of oxytocin in the first year of life could provide the right conditions for an outer-centric bias by suppressing attention to the self. And if so, might it be that baseline oxytocin levels would be associated with mirror self-recognition, such that oxytocin levels would need to sort of drop to a certain level before a self-representation could emerge. And so one of the things we do now routinely in the lab is to collect saliva samples from all the babies who come in and take part in our studies so that we can look at whether there's a relationship between oxytocin levels and our measures of self and other representation. So at some point, I will be able to tell you whether that's the case. And the other thing that I'm currently really interested in and that we have a new grant to look at is the role of interpersonal synchrony. So this is the sort of temporal coordination of rhythmic behavior between individuals and its role in an outer-centric bias. So we know that interpersonal synchrony is a source of self-other overlap or interference in adults, and that infancy is characterized by high levels of interpersonal synchrony because of the close relationship between the infant and the caregiver. And so one possibility is that interpersonal synchrony enhances self-other overlap in infants, and by doing so, sort of inhibits the emergence of a distinct self-representation. And very speculatively, but I recently read a paper comparing mirror self-recognition between a Western population of toddlers and a population in Vanuatu. And it's a beautiful paper. And what they find is that most Vanuatu toddlers, like in many non-Western cultures, exhibit mirror self-recognition later. And they found that maternal imitation was the only predictor of the emergence of mirror self-recognition in this culture. And I thought that one of the observations that they made was particularly interesting. So in noting that maternal imitation can be both sequential and simultaneous, they write the following. So they say, we noticed that simultaneous imitation examples, for example, swinging to both sides while sitting face to face with arms attached, were more common in Vanuatu, which may be supporting a feeling of oneness as opposed to separateness. And I think this may indeed suggest that inputs which enhance a feeling of oneness, or what I would call self-other overlap, may indeed be associated with a more delayed self-representations, which obviously has implications for an outer-centric bias. Okay, so I've shown you evidence that early infancy may be characterized by an outer-centric bias, which is waning by about 12 months and likely influenced by the emergence of self-representation. And I hope you will agree that there are important implications here for building socially intelligent systems, in the sense that, in the words of the sort of truism of Darcy Thompson, everything is the way it is because it got that way. So if we want to build machines with human-level social intelligence, we have to understand how they got the way that they did, how they got to understand the way that they are. And in this case, consider how an early period of extreme outer-centricism, which then gives way to egocentricism, which then gives way to a balance, how this will contribute to what will eventually become our adult social intelligence. So I'm probably out of time. This is just to recognize my group and the people that collected the data and who contributed to this theory. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for the great talk. We have time for one question from the audience.
Professor Victoria, I have like question about like you said that the in the co-witness test, said that it's probably the joint attention from the like a person watching the event and the like that witness itself is what caused infants to like this alternative, enlisted this alternative bias and let the infants misremember, cause the misremembering or remember the object they attend to better. I was wondering if you guys have ever tried that, like something that is not social, like something that doesn't have like gaze direction or like no, do not have eyes, but like, so like doesn't cause this joint attention, but still is present there to see if there isn't like baseline effect, like like are infants actually paying attention to their gaze, or it's more like a presence of others?
Right. No, so we don't have a condition with a non, like something that is non-agentive, that is directing attention. So, but I think I would expect that, I mean, there is so much data suggesting that babies over attribute or overuse things that are not strictly agents as directional cues. So I would guess that it would probably work. I think that its function is, or that it is there to follow the attention of other animate agents, caregivers, etc. But I wouldn't be surprised if a non-agent directional cue might have a similar effect. I just want to say though, I don't think, so I think we're careful to say that we don't think it's about joint attention, in the sense that we don't think that there is any sort of triangulation, that babies recognize that the agent sees the object in a particular way. It's more that the agent, we think that babies are using the direction of attention of the agent to sort of prioritize what the agent is actually, the target of the agent's attention, rather than understanding that the agent sees that object in a particular way, or that's their perspective. So that's just to clarify that.
Thank you so much. The results are amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Southgate. I think we're going to move on to our next speaker.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the talk. Next, we'll have Professor Jacob Forster to give us a talk about his work. Jacob Forster is an associate professor in the Department of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford, and his research includes multi-agent reinforcement learning, human-AI coordination, emergent communication, search, planning, and game theory. And Jacob did his PhD at the University of Oxford, where he helped bring deep multi-agent reinforcement learning to the forefront of AI research. He also won the Outstanding Student Paper Award at AAAI 2018 for his excellent paper, Counterfactual Multi-Agent Policy Gradient, and the Best Paper Runner-Up Award at SML 2018 for his work, The Mechanism of N-Player Differentiable Games. So let's welcome Jacob for his talk on zero-shot coordination and off-belief learning.
Thank you so much for having me. In the next 35 minutes or so, I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey. Hopefully I will get across some of the interesting questions I've been thinking about in the space of coordination, how we can frame coordination as a multi-agent problem. And if we have time, I'll provide also some answers. To be clear, I would like to make this talk as interactive as possible. I think it's a little bit ironic that we have a workshop on social intelligence and all the cameras are turned off. So if you can at all, if you're in a position where you can turn on your camera and are willing to engage in this talk, that would be greatly appreciated, just to make it more fun for everyone. So if you can turn on the camera and just, it doesn't feel like I'm speaking to the void, that would be great. Try and make it interactive, because this is about social intelligence. And thank you for those who already did it. This talk is structured as follows. I will start by motivating why do I think that we need to care about coordination, and then also how can we frame this as a machine learning problem? What does it even mean to try and coordinate with another agent? And once you've gone through this, I hope I can introduce you to a recent paper of mine that's called off-belief learning. And at this point, I have to warn you a little bit. Off-belief learning, I think, is a beautiful paper, but it's a little bit mind-boggling. So don't be disappointed if you don't immediately understand it. But hopefully we have enough time to at least motivate you that it's worth looking into a little bit more. With that out of the way, let's get started on the actual content. Why do we need to care about coordination? And there is one regime in which cooperative multi-agent learning has really seen a huge amount of progress. And that is in settings where we have a number of different agents, here shown as the blue, the red, and the green, and that obtain their own observations O, take their own actions U, and get a shared reward R. And as long as we can control all of these agents, both during training, for example, in the simulator, and at test time, then we've seen huge amounts of progress in the last 5 to 10 years in how to learn complex policies in complex settings. And this is commonly framed as a DEC-POM-DP, a decentralized partially observable market decision process. And yes, it requires a lot of learning samples, but ultimately, if you throw enough compute and samples at these problem settings, you can typically find high-performing policies that work extremely well for this specific set of training time partners. But as you can probably imagine, the real world commonly contains other agents. Those might be independently trained AI agents, or might also be pesky humans with which you want to coordinate at test time. So the challenge here is, how do we develop methods that allow us to, at test time, work with other unseen novel partners when we cannot do joint training? And that's obviously an important AI problem. There's a second motivation, and that is beneficial AI, right? We all know that one of the goals of AI is to build humans that can help and support, to build AI agents that can help and support humans. And what is this problem actually on paper? We all know what this is, sort of like human AI coordination, but what is it actually formally speaking? What is this as a technical problem setting? Well, clearly it's a multi-agent problem because I have the human and the AI agent. And it's also fully cooperative because the only goal here is to help the human. So remember on the previous slide, we had this common reward function in orange, the R, the reward is shared across all agents, one team, one dream. And in the beneficial AI setting, I have a single reward function that is relevant. And that is the reward of the human, because I'm trying to get a robot to help the human achieve its goal. Now you might argue, well, we don't know the reward function. Well, of course you don't. And this is why beneficial AI is hard. But this is just like one of the many things we don't know about the world. We have to make inferences about many other things in partially observable settings. And that's what we have this formalism for, the decentralized partially observable market decision process. And this has actually been known, that human AI coordination is a DEC-POM-DP. So on the previous slide, I told you that we have these scalable learning methods that can actually find approximate solutions for these DEC-POM-DPs in complex settings. Now I tell you that to build a robot that can help a human is a DEC-POM-DP. So why aren't we done? Why don't we have lots of robots now that can smoothly interact with humans and help and support them? What is going on? Does anyone have any idea what the issue might be? Or are there any questions at this point? Why aren't we done? Right? We have methods that find approximate solutions to complex, partially observable, fully cooperative multi-agent settings. And one of the special instances is building beneficial AI agents. Why can't we simply apply these methods and then develop, robots that can really help and support humans? What is the problem?
It might be hard for the robot to understand humans' goal.
Okay, I think this is getting exactly in the right direction, right? The reason is the regime where we can make progress is in joint training, when we can train all the agents together in the simulator, right? But humans are slow. We can't get 20 billion samples, so we can't carry out joint training, right? So we now have to think about how do we train in one team so that we can generalize to a different team. Okay, and that is what I mean by coordination. By coordination, I mean in this talk in particular, working with another agent at test time when the problem setting is common knowledge. So the deck point is known exactly, but you cannot pre-agree on a strategy. That is what I mean by coordination as opposed to joint training. Are there any questions on this? Because if this doesn't make sense, then probably the next 25 minutes or so won't also make sense. So it's better to ask questions now, and there are no bad questions. Any questions at all? I take it everything is clear, so I will move on. So at this point, we have two challenges. The first one is, what is actually good problem setting to study these types of problems? And then how do we frame coordination as a machine learning task? Okay. And the first issue here is that the standard benchmarks that we use in multi-agent learning, such as poker, Go, and chess, happen to be competitive. So we've developed methods now that allow us to beat humans at most competitive games, 2 player 0 sum, no matter how many decades of their life they've practiced playing those games. We can now beat them with state-of-the-art machine learning methods that leverage large-scale computing. However, as I pointed out, helping and supporting humans is a fully cooperative task. So what if we don't want to make humans cry, as we're doing it right now with chess, poker, and Go, we instead need benchmarks that are fully cooperative. And fortunately, there is a benchmark. It's called Hanabi that we introduced in 2019. And Hanabi is a fully cooperative, partially observable environment that's all about theory of mind. Can I have a brief show of hands to see who actually knows Hanabi? Can I have a thumbs up, anyone who knows Hanabi? Perfect. Would anyone like to explain the game Hanabi? I take it that's a no, so I will talk you through it. So the first thing to remember is that Hanabi is a fully cooperative game, which means it is one team and one dream. The goal is to play together as one team. The twist in Hanabi is that unlike most card games, rather than looking at my own cards, holding them like this, each player is holding the cards away from themselves. And this means that the entire challenge of Hanabi is theory of mind, figuring out what to do given the moves of other players, right? Because I can't observe my cards, you can observe my cards. And at this point, it's about me understanding what your intention might be for whatever action you're taking in a given turn. To illustrate this a little bit more, let me go through the motions of Hanabi. So here's an abstract representation of the game, where you see these are the cards that I am holding. These are the cards of my partner. And the main game mechanism is to provide hints. In particular, I can play costly tokens, shown here, to provide information to my partner. It's an extremely limited channel. And what I can do is I can reveal properties of other cards. So for example, I can either point out all the cards of a given color or a given rank. Legal hints would be something like saying, this card is your only one, or these cards are both blue. But it's a revealing hint that reveals an entire set of a given property. Let's go through a move. And just to be clear, the goal is to play these cards in a legal order, starting with a 1 for each color and ending with a 5. So for example, at this point, the partner could in principle play this 1, which would then start the fireworks for the green cards. And we're getting 1 point for each card that we play. Okay, and again, it is fully cooperative. And these are your partner's cards and those are your cards. At this point, our partner tells us that these 2 cards are both 1s. And my question to all of you now is, what would you do if your partner tells you that you're holding 2 1s in your hand? What would you do?
I think I would drop 1 card.
You would drop 1 card. What does that mean? Do you mean you would play it or you would throw it away?
Oh, sorry. Maybe I should ask if they are in the same color, I'll throw it away. Yeah.
So you don't know the colors of these cards. You've just been told that these cards are both 1s. And the goal is to play fireworks, starting with a 1, ending with a 5, 1 for each color. I repeat.
I'll just randomly select 1 and put it play it.
Correct. So you can randomly pick one of these cards and you can play it. And importantly, you don't have to assign the correct firework. As long as the card is playable, this is a legal move. Okay. And we should note that we had 8 hint tokens. Now we've lost 1 hint token as a team. Now we have 7 hint tokens. Okay. And at this point, we are going to play this card, which turned out to be the red one. And congratulations, we just got a point, right? This is great news. We now have a point. As the next move, and by the way, anyone who's not interacting, if you do have questions, please jump in. It's not going to get any better if something is unclear. And please just ask any questions, okay? So at the next point, at the next move, our partner tells us that our first card is red. And my question goes out to the group. What do you do if your partner tells you that your first card is red?
It's
Somebody
the partner is hinting at the fact that we should put that card down as and
interesting.
therefore infer that it might be a 2.
Very, very good. So at this point, right, we've made the assumption that the partner is reasonable, understands the game, and that by hinting that this card is red, they might be pointing to the fact that this card might be playable, and therefore this is probably the red 2. And we're going to make this inference, and we're going to play this card, and congratulations, we get another point. Okay. This was extremely sensible. So if we just had a partner where we know we've explained the rules, they understand the game, this is exactly what humans can do. Let me ask you a follow-up question. If you got to the same position, but you knew that your partner was a random bot that just acted completely randomly and happened to randomly tell you that this card is red, what would you do now? If a completely random player told you that your first card is red,
You would play the 1 instead because that's a guaranteed piece of information they already have.
very good. So that's a very safe option anyway. Would you still believe that this card is playable or not? If a random player told you, so we just said if an informed player tells you this is a red card, probably this card is playable. What if a random player told you this card is playable, is a red? Would you still believe that this card is playable? Yes or no?
No,
Why is that?
because their incentives aren't aligned with ours, and therefore the reason why they might have chosen to take that action might not be to help us lay down fireworks.
That sounds like a reasonable explanation. To be clear, it's a fully random agent. We don't have to make hypotheses about what the incentives might or may not be, right? We know exactly what the policy was that picked this action, which is fully random. And I would argue fully random policy doesn't have incentives, not aligned or unaligned. So if a random player decides to tell you, takes the random action of telling you this card is red, what we know is this card is red, right? Because the color is revealed through the game, but we obviously don't know anything else. And that idea that when we're receiving information from other agents, we're observing the actions of others, to interpret them beyond what is actually revealed in the environment requires us to make assumptions about who took that action, is one of the core challenges that makes coordination hard, because it can lead to misunderstanding, it can lead to misinterpretation. What I'd like to do now in the next part of the talk is to first outline a problem setting that lets us study this problem formulation, and then present a method that addresses exactly this issue of how to prevent agents from learning arbitrary protocols. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so we've played this card, and I'm assuming everyone's on board. To interpret the actions of others requires us to make assumptions about who it was that was acting so far. So we have a problem setting. We're saying Hanabi is a good start because it's fully cooperative and partially observable. The second issue is the problem formulation. What are we maximizing? And in particular, the progress that has been made in Hanabi is in the joint training regime, where we're training one team together and we're then testing that same team, trying to maximize the reward that this team obtains when paired in that exact constellation. The challenge being that this is a fantastic idea if and only if you're looking at two-player zero-sum. And that is because all Nash equilibria in these settings are interchangeable. If you can't be beaten by a worst-case opponent at training time, then you also can't be beaten by a worst-case opponent at test time. And therefore, I can guarantee by finding an approximate Nash equilibrium that no human or no other agent can beat me at test time. Right? So Nash equilibrium is in some sense all you need for two-player zero-sum. The challenge is that in cooperative settings, these policies that are approximate Nash equilibria only perform well within a specific team of training time partners and will not generalize to any other agents in the real world. And that's visualized here, where we've shown the cross-play matrix, where we're training the exact same state-of-the-art learning algorithm in Hanabi 12 times over, and we're producing mixed teams across the different training runs. So each of these rows and columns is matching an agent, player 1 from the row index and player 2 from the column index. And what you can see when row matches column, that's the self-play team that was exposed during joint training, they get about 24 points in expectation, and on the off diagonal, they get near 0 points. So the cross-play score when being paired with a different partner is very, very low. And also this low performance in cross-play translates to very low human AI score when being paired with a human proxy bot that was trained on supervised data. And this is quite intuitive because the conventions these agents learn are extremely cryptic. So for example, one agent could use red or yellow to say, you should play the newest card, and another agent might use some completely different colors to mean something very different, right? So for example, in the case where the agent said your first card is red, it might mean that you should throw away your fourth card. Highly arbitrary conventions that do not follow from the game rules. Okay, and this comes out of joint training. So now we've seen that joint training is not sufficient for developing bots that can coordinate with other agents at test time. They only work within a specific team of training time partners. Are there any questions on this? Good. So then let's talk about problem formulations. What could we do instead? So joint training is what everyone does. That doesn't work. Instead, we could go straight to human-AI coordination as the evaluation scheme. And the benefit is we don't have to think about proxies. I can just try and find machine learning algorithms that do well when being paired with a human in these cooperative settings. So for example, I have a machine learning algorithm that trains on human data and gets evaluated with humans when playing Hanabi. The issue is that now as a scientist, we want to make progress on human-AI coordination with machine learning. I have to continuously test with humans to evaluate progress. And this is both time consuming and it will actually reduce reproducibility because suddenly the exact outcome of my method depends on the exact pool of humans chosen to test my algorithms. And also it's hard to generalize novel problem settings because I have to recruit new humans and the exact, again, incentives and so on all change the outcomes. And obviously I don't account for AI coordination, which might be another issue. For example, if you have Tesla cars and Waymo cars encountering the streets, that's an issue of AI coordination, which isn't described at all by human AI coordination. And this kind of problem is quite common. For example, in medicine, we don't test vaccines straight on humans. Instead, we have proxy settings, such as model organisms that are more reproducible, are cheaper, and have less ethical concerns, and that we understand more closely. Only if we make progress here do we then progress to the human trial. And the question is, what is a good proxy setting for coordination that can be evaluated without using human data? And our proposal is what we call zero-shot coordination, and we introduced this new formal framework at our ICML 2020 paper, other play. And the formulation of zero-shot coordination is that instead of doing maximizing for joint training as the only training objective, the goal is to find algorithms such that if they're trained independently twice over, the teams do well at test time. And importantly, the training is carried out without any communication between the two implementations, the two training runs. So you can think of this as trying to train football teams in a setting where the coaches can agree on a high-level training strategy before training starts, but that's the only common knowledge between them beyond the rules of football. What does this look like pictorially? So in the joint training, we're maximizing the self-play objective, where we're simply looking at the diagonal elements of the cross-play matrix. We can evaluate these and we maximize them during training, and that's also the test time objective. In contrast, in zero-shot coordination, we maximize for the off-diagonal elements. but crucially, we can't access them during training. So we're now trying to find algorithms that allow us to maximize the off diagonal when being paired with independent implementations of the same algorithm without ever being able to evaluate them during training. And that is our framing for how we can think about coordination as a machine learning problem without having to go directly to human data. Are there any questions on this? This should be quite confusing. So if you're not confused, either I'm doing a very good job explaining it, or everyone's completely lost. Can I have a thumbs up if you're understanding what's going on? Okay, I see a few people who don't raise their thumbs. Mehdi, you didn't raise your thumbs. Do you have any questions? Sorry to pick on you. Oh, thumbs up, okay. Very good. Fantastic. Moving on. So this is our objective. Now, does anyone know about ad hoc team play? Is this interesting to anyone? I can either skip the comparison to ad hoc team play or I can dive into it and we can go onto off-belief learning. Depends what people prefer. This is basically just explaining how this differs from previous approaches towards coordination in multi-agent learning. Can I have a thumbs up if anyone would like to go into this in any detail? Otherwise, I'll go on to off-belief learning. Thumbs up. Okay. So ad hoc team play basically says we're going to play a best response to a pool of agents. And that's how I think about coordination. I'm good at coordination if I can play a best response to a pool, right? It's able to efficiently collaborate with previously unknown teammates, blah-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. Okay, so let's go through a little example task to illustrate the difference of this impromptu team play and ad hoc team play compared to zero-shot coordination. Imagine that we're trying to play this lever game as shown on the bottom right on the screen. Okay, in this lever game, the rules are as follows. If and only if you and I pick the exact same lever in a single interaction, then we obtain the reward that's written down next to this given lever. If we pick different levers, we get 0 points. The rules are common knowledge, and you can assume that the other player you're playing with is as rational as you are, but independently applying the same type of reasoning. That is zero-shot coordination. The overall solution approach is common knowledge, but you can't agree on the specific solution. It has to come out of the overall approach. That is what I mean by coordination. What do you play in this game?
0.9.
Thumbs up for anybody else who also plays 0.9. Fantastic. What would an optimal joint training agent do? 1.0, exactly, right? So now let's think about what ad hoc team play tells you. Ad hoc team play says we're going to get a pool, let's say it's optimal agents, doesn't actually matter. We get a pool of optimal self-play agents or joint training agents. They play any of the 1.0 levers with the same probability because these are optimal joint strategies. Now my question is, what is the best response to a pool of optimal joint training agents? So what is optimal ad hoc team play? If you know you're being paired with an arbitrary optimal joint training agent, what do you play? 1.0, an arbitrary 1.0 lever. Okay, and this shows the difference between impromptu team play and ad hoc team play, as opposed to zero-shot coordination. Ad hoc team play commonly will give you solutions that have nothing to do with coordination, depending on the pool. Because the way that you specify the pool changes the entire outcome. While in zero-shot coordination, we're looking for self-consistent approaches towards solving coordination problems. And in particular, in this case, playing the 0.9 is the only unique solution. So if we're both looking for that kind of coordination awareness, that independent reasoning lets us converge to 0.9 independently. And we have an algorithm that does exactly this.
I have a quick question in clarifying this. This seems reminiscent of league training in Alpha Star, I believe, and it's the Alpha Star is basically the competitive equivalent of this approach, where you maintain a pool, what they call a league, of adversarial policies, and you continue to train them. Is that a good interpretation for this?
Yeah, so ad hoc team play, one instantiation of ad hoc team play, if you play the best response to random pool or another pool of self-play agents, ad hoc team play then looks a lot like other league problems or population-based approaches in AlphaStar. But to be clear again, AlphaStar-like approaches, population-based approaches, they will all converge on picking an arbitrary 1.0 lever. They will not get you to play the 0.9. That's again, the AlphaStar looks like an ad hoc team play type approach because you're playing the best response to a population.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and we can push this a little bit farther. So for example, if you play the iterated game, we're playing the same game 1,000 times over. What's the optimal social coordination strategy? Well, if you can observe each other's action afterwards, we should stick or switch with 50-50 probability until we converge on the same lever. What is optimal joint training? Optimal joint training can pick a different lever at every single time step jointly, which means there's a space of 9 to the 1,000 joint optimal policies and playing the best response to these policies. For example, doing something like AlphaStar or whatever it is, we'll then play a random 1.0 lever at every time step. Okay? So hopefully that illustrates the difference between our new problem setting that we're trying to encourage people to think about seriously if you're interested in coordination from a machine learning point of view, and existing approaches such as impromptu and ad hoc team play. So I will skip to this. There's some related work where we look at human-eye coordination as a post hoc finding rather than by thinking about coordination itself. And the rest of the talk, I will deep dive on one specific instance of this coordination challenge, which is how to prevent agents from learning arbitrary conventions in DECPOM DPs. And this is much like a bee waggle dance. We can imagine that these bees can communicate information to each other by their exact way that they waggle their wings. And where this has come from in Hanabi, well, this comes from the joint training loop, whereby an agent happens to throw away some card and then some other card is playable in that situation. And this gets reinforced up to a point where suddenly, whenever I discard my second card, it means you should play your first card. And we can form these very arbitrary conventions. And we can highlight this a little bit by looking at a thought experiment where we have Alice and Bob. Alice observes a cat or a dog on the left side of a barrier. She can either turn on or off the light bulb or remove this barrier, but removing the barrier costs $5. And now Bob can either observe the state of the light bulb, is it on or off, or can actually see there's a cat or a dog if the barrier was removed. And they get 10 points if they get it correct, if Bob guesses correctly. So my question to all of you is, what is the optimal policy if you're doing joint training? So state-of-the-art machine learning for multi-agent settings in this problem. What's the correct policy that maximizes expected return for Alice and Bob, given that Bob tries to guess if there's a cat or a dog on this side of the barrier? Correct. Joint training should just use the light. Very, very good, because you can use this light to signal cat or dog. Right, someone just messaged here, thank you in the chat, Mikhail. Good. What happens if you're doing zero-shot coordination? What's the optimal policy? What if you're working with someone? Again, the problem setting is common knowledge, but only the problem setting, you cannot agree on a specific policy. You have a single shot of interaction.
You can pay to remove the barrier at a cost of $5 and get an expected reward of $5.
Very, very good. Exactly. Does that make sense to everyone? Right. So basically, if you're not allowed to form arbitrary conventions, which you can't rely on in coordination problems, then you have to pay the $5 to remove the barrier. And the next part of the talk is about how to address the specific problem of preventing arbitrary conventions that emerge in the joint training in multi-agent systems, in fully coupled multi-agent systems. Does anyone have an idea for how we could go about learning to remove the barrier rather than relying on the signaling during training? Well, I guess you haven't read the off-belief learning paper, so let me move on. But that's what we're going to do now. Right? What we're doing now is we're breaking the loop between the past actions of one agent and their policy and the information content revealed to other agents in the environment. And the crucial idea of off-belief learning is that we're interpreting past actions no longer according to the policy that we're training Pi 1. This policy is being trained right now for the team. It's a joint policy for all players. But we're assuming that past actions were taken by a given fixed policy Pi 0 instead. And this is very much like that thought experiment where he said, what if you knew that the previous action, this card is red, was taken by a random player? Because crucially, whenever Pi 0 is a random policy, the only information we're obtaining from that action is what is revealed through the environment. And we thereby prevent agents from forming conventions during training. So for example, if a random agent tells you the first card is red, this can only ever mean that this card is indeed red. And this can never mean that I should play my second card, right? Because a random agent doesn't have intent. Another way to put this. So how does this look like? So in off-belief in self-play or joint training, if I have a policy where Alice turns on the light whenever there's a cut, Bob observes that the light is on and the barrier is down, and Bob's best action then is just guess for a cut and they get 10 points. In contrast, if Alice now decided to remove the barrier, they would get 5 points, even if Bob acts optimally, given the observation. Under off-belief learning, the same happens. There's a cut. Alice turns on the light, if and only if there's a cut. Bob observes that the light bulb is on and that the barrier is down. However, Bob never actually learns from what happens in the world. Instead, Bob learns from what would have happened in the world had he gotten to this action observation history, which is the light bulb is on, by playing with a random player. And my question to all of you is, what is the probability of there being a cut if a random player turned on the light bulb?
Equal weight on both outcomes, he'd guess, Bob would guess with equal chance between cat and dog.
If the questions are clear, you're allowed to ask clarifications.
Bob would guess with equal probability between cat and dog.
Yes, correct. But I'm also asking what is the probability of there being a cat or dog rather than Bob's actions. But yes, so assuming Bob is optimal. Thank you very much. Yeah. So the probability of there being a cat or dog, if the random player turned on the light bulb, is exactly the prior probability of cat or dog. Because the random player obviously can't convey information through the action. They didn't even look at if there's a cat or dog. They're taking random actions. I have a feeling that this concept is still unclear to people. And this is the core of off-belief learning. So does anyone have any questions about this? So again, I'm going to contrast this here. So if Alice only ever turns on the light bulb when there's a cat, given that Bob observes observes the light bulb being on, Bob knows there's 100% probability of there being a cut, because Alice only turns on the light bulb when there's a cut. In contrast, if we are pretending that a random player instead of Alice, remember past actions get interpreted according to a different policy by 0. A random player turned on the light bulb, then suddenly the probability is exactly the same as the prior probability, which is 50-50. And under that prior probability, the optimal action is to randomly play cat or dog, and you get 0 points in expected return. And that's what off-belief learning is about, because under the same formalism, if Alice moves the barrier, Bob now observes the light bulb is off, but Bob can see a cat. And what's the probability of there being a cat if a random player removed the barrier? You're allowed to say it. Yes, it's 100%. Thank you. I realize these interactive talks are much harder when, having them online, but I appreciate those people are taking part in it. I think it makes it more fun for everyone. Yeah. So if under this off-belief learning, if I now reinterpret what if a random player had taken away the barrier, it's still a cat. And under that, the optimal action is to guess cat, and we get 5 points. Which means that now under off-belief learning, 5 points is more than 0 points. Therefore, Alice will actually learn to remove the barrier as opposed to signaling, reinforcing the signaling through the light bulb. And that's the crucial idea of off-belief learning. We're learning not from outcomes as they happened when playing Pi 1 with Pi 1, the policy that we're training. We're learning from the outcomes that would have happened had we gotten to the actual observation history of observation by being paired with a different policy, in particular a random policy in the simplest case. And the actual implementation of this uses in our paper Q-learning. So here's independent Q-learning, where we just have some state, we take an action and we observe the outcome, and that becomes our target computation. So we evaluate the effect of our actions by learning from the samples of the environment as we're playing in the stack DP. And in contrast, in off-belief learning, we never learn from what really happened in the world, but we learn from what would have happened had we taken this action AI by being paired with a random partner Pi 0, and we do so by sampling a fictitious state, in this case resampling Cadeau dark from a different belief function, and evaluating the effect of our actions based on that fictitious state. And then we calculate the target from that fictitious state transition. So it doesn't matter what happens during training. Yes, you hinted red and I played the card, it was playable. I don't care. What I care about is you hinted red, I pretend you were a random player, I reshuffled the cards on my hand as if a random player had hinted red, and then I evaluate what would have been the effect of playing my first card. Congratulations, it didn't work. Because the card was red, it wasn't a playable 2, it was a 3 or 4 or 5 with an equal probability. Off-belief learning takes deck DP learning, which has a lot of equilibria and has a huge amount of chaos, into the theoretical properties of learning in MDPs. It has a lot of sound theory because there's a unique optimal policy for any softmax temperature for a given Pi 0, and it is a policy improvement operator where the suboptimality vanishes as the temperature goes to 0. And if you repeat this operator, you converge to an epsilon subgame perfect equilibrium in the deck DP. So there's a lot more details in the paper. This is just showing you that we can actually learn this optimal grounded policy. And you might ask, well, but you can't play Hanabi. Imagine playing with a bot and this bot goes, you go to the bot, this first card is red. You all saw this, we would all have played the card. It would be quite frustrating if the bot doesn't play that card, right? Because in this off-belief learning where you have to go, this card is red, the bot goes, yes, I get it, so what? You actually have to go and say this card is a 2, then the bot goes, oh, it's a red 2, I now trust you, random agent said red 2, I can play the card. So what if we need some amount of counterfactual reasoning? And it turns out we can build a hierarchy of off-belief learning where at each level I, we're now assuming that the past actions were taken by the level below I minus 1. And in the simplest, at level 1, this is just a random policy, which means we're learning this grounded policy that only ever hints using colors and ranks in this very grounded fashion. But at the next level up, I'm now interpreting your past actions as coming from the grounded policy. And because the grounded policy plays useful grounded information, I now know that the hint was probably useful. So if now at level 1 agent tells me this card is red, I'm like, well, the next move you tell me it's a 2, I can just play it now. Save yourself the hassle. Okay, and then we can actually build up this hierarchy that really mirrors the way that humans learn to play in Hanabi.
I have a quick question. I have a quick question. Would this mean that you have to you have the different teams doing different training, but then you have to pre-agree on the top number of levels in the hierarchy? So
very good, very good. So to make it more robust, what you can do is you can play best response to a very number of teams, for example, right? So you could imagine that you're playing a best response to, you want to be robust based in zero-shot coordination because we can't pre-agree on the number of levels, right? So during independent training, we have to have, this is our algorithm we're going to use, and we're going to, independently now try and find the level that's robust in crossplay. That works without pre-agreement.
It seems like this is taking the trade-off of actually, never mind. Yeah, thank you.
Does that make sense? So we just want to get.
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah.
But it's a very good question. So you've probably heard of cognitive hierarchies where we're playing best response to random agents. and then go from there, right? A very similar idea, but crucially different in one aspect. In cognitive hierarchies, we're also assuming that the past actions come from some fixed policy. But crucially, we also assume that the future action taken by that same random policy, as opposed to the policy by one. And what this means is, for example, in the cat dog game, we will not pay $5 to remove the barrier, because a random Bob will simply ignore the fact that there's a cat or a dog. It's frustrating enough if you have a miscommunication around the light bulb. Imagine how much worse it is if you actually remove the barrier, your partner can see there's a cat or a dog, and then they guess the opposite because they're random, right? So the crucial difference between cognitive hierarchies and off-belief learning is the assumption about the future actions being taken by either the same fixed policy or by ourselves.
I have a follow-up question to the tuning the number of levels in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
What's your intuition on sort of choosing the level of the hierarchy? Because at least intuitively, it seems like for some games there exists a maximum level of hierarchy that a minimum level that needs to be achieved, such that you can do all sorts of like reasoning within this game. What's your...
Very, very good. So this is a fantastic point. Leads me very nicely to the next slide. And what's nice is, so if you think about cognitive research, there's a vague notion that humans do some turns of counterfactual reasoning, but they don't do an infinite number. So something between 2 and 6 probably is roughly what humans do in these settings. It turns out if you look at off-belief learning and you train up to level 4, you obtain a play style that closely mirrors what humans do in these settings. So here what I'm showing is off-belief learning 4 in terms of the way that it plays colors, grounded or not grounded, and this closely mirrors the way that a supervised bot plays. Red means we know color and rank, so it's fully grounded. Blue means only rank, and yellow means only color. And those percentages end up much more closely than we've seen with other machine learning methods. So around level 4, and this is also represented in our evaluation. If we look at the ad hoc team play score, when we're pairing our different levels, level 1 through level 4, with this clone bot that mirrors human play, we get around 16 points, which was the state of the art at the time. And this is a lot higher than what we'd seen with our self-play methods, some coordination-specific methods, and K-level reasoning approaches. Okay, so this was at the time, it's the first bot that we've trained that you can really get a feeling that it understands what you're trying to say when you're playing with it. And it matches, broadly speaking, the intuitions we had around how many levels of counterfactual reasoning you should take in these settings. So with that, I'm coming to the end of my talk. We've done a lot of work now in the space of zero-shot coordination. Here are some example papers that we've published. And I want to do a shout out here to off-belief learning, because both the code is open sourced and there's also an interactive demo available at bit.ly/OBL blog. Everything is written in a way that is academia friendly. So while a lot of this work was done with fantastic collaborators across during my time at Facebook Area Research, the code can be run in academia because it only requires a couple of GPUs. It does not require server farms. It's really done in a way that can be pursued in academia. It's open source. There's UIs available for playing with these bots and doing human testing. And also I'm now building up a lab at Oxford that is continuing a lot of this work and work, more generally speaking, in general some learning and human-AI coordination. So if that's something you're interested in, please do get in touch. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and open the floor for any last-minute questions. And also thank you for participating for those of you who did.
Time for 1 or 2 questions. Anyone from the audience? Or Zoom?
I have a question. Thanks for the great talk, and it's so interesting. There are many interesting games and different ways to think about this multi-agent coordination problem. So I also noticed there are many pre-trained sequential modeling models. For example, pre-trained language models, they are used for decision-making tasks, and they seem like achieve good zero-shot generalization ability. So how do you think about of using such sequential modeling, like pre-trained sequential modeling models to solve such multi-agent coordination tasks, especially when they're like natural language communications between the agents? Would that be interesting research direction?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a, an orthogonal axis, which is, how do you do natural language communication? But to be clear, even if you had a perfect natural language system, you realize that if you trained a reinforcement learning agent on top of this system, it wouldn't have to utilize any of the natural language, because in simulation, it could simply invent its own language, right? So none of this is solved by using a language model or captioning system or anything else generates text, because the challenge is about preventing policies that are incompatible with coordination. How do you prevent agents from developing policies that are incompatible with humans at test time? And I'm trying to find sound methods that can actually leverage large-scale compute, large-scale simulation, as opposed to just using human data. Right? I'm looking for the conceptual and formal tools that we have for two-player zero-sum competitive settings for the cooperative case. That's what I'm looking for. If you just give me enough compute and have an accurate description of the problem setting, I'd like to be able to find coordination-aware policies that are then compatible with number partners at test time. And will large-scale sequential models pre-trained yada be a part of it? Yes, of course, at some point, but they do not solve the issues I have.
I see.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Unfortunately, we don't have time for the coffee break, so I think we're going to move on to our third speaker. Should be an in-person talk, actually.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And sorry if I talked through your break.
Yeah, so I will be introducing our third speaker, Julian Hara Adinger.
Should I join the Zoom?
Yes. Yes.
Where is the link?
Oh, okay. Okay. Right. So Julian Adinger is a colleague scientist at Yale's Department of Psychology and the Wusa Institute. His research group, the Computational Social Cognition Lab, aims to understand the representation and computation that support human social intelligence, understand how they emerge and develop, and use them to build more human-like machine social intelligence. And just on a personal level, many of his work has been very inspirational to my own research. So I'm really excited to have him here talking about more of his recent work. And his talk is going to be about institutional representation for machine social intelligence. That's welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, 1 second. My competence at using Zoom just goes down so much whenever I'm presenting. I think it's set. Yeah, okay. Hopefully this is working. Oh yeah, cool, okay. Great, let me put this. Yeah, thanks so much for being here and for having me here. And thanks to the organizers for making this happen. Maybe I'll just hold this. Yeah, so I thought what would be kind of interesting for today is instead of talking about the usual stuff that's already published, I want to talk about some stuff that I've been thinking a lot about. We haven't done as much work on it. So it's going to be mostly kind of a theoretical talk on some ideas that I found helpful in thinking about social cognition. There is going to be a little bit of data at the end. And before I start, I think it's also helpful to establish some common ground on like what the ultimate goal is. When we say we want something like machine social intelligence, like what do we actually mean? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I'm gonna tell you what it means to me through some demos. or videos. So this is a first-person view of a McDonald's employee. And he's basically doing a physical task, right? He's assembling burgers. But you might notice that he's actually sharing the workspace with another coworker. And they're also sharing some responsibility. So he's not fully finishing things and then he's passing them on sometimes. And if you are here, you need to have some kind of not just physical knowledge, but some social representations, right? You need to be tracking where the other person is to make sure that you're not running into one another. You can coordinate efficiently. Here's another case. These are workers at an oil rig. And you can see they're doing this kind of very complicated cooperative task. And again, if you were here, the most obvious things that you need here are to have a lot of knowledge about how oil rigs work, and you need a lot of physical competence. But again, it's really hard to get this kind of very smooth and efficient cooperation unless there's some kind of social tracking where you're trying to make sure that everyone is doing their part at the right time. And I think these are the kinds of domains where there's also this kind of hope that at some point in the future, we might have machines that can either do these things independently, working with each other or with humans. But when we talk about kind of social intelligence, I think we mean much more than this kind of domain-specific competence. We also mean understanding these less structured environments. So this is Grand Central and a crowd. And if you're here and you wanted to navigate this environment, like you can't treat every person as an obstacle, right? You need to realize that as you're moving, everyone else is moving at the same time, and they're moving in different directions and at different speeds. But more than that, right? Sometimes like you might be walking and you're gonna realize that you need to be avoiding people, but other people might also be trying to avoid you at the same time. And when you realize you might crash into someone, you need to quickly figure out, is the other person also aware of this, or are they on their phone or kind of mind wandering, and who's the one that's gonna do kind of the reaction. So I think this is the kind of scope that ultimately we want to aim for. We want frameworks and models that are able to do all of these things and as easily as humans do them. So I'm thinking about it in terms of like we want human-like social reasoning and thus understanding, so that we can see these things and understand what's happening, that we can make predictions about what other people are going to do next, and also planning over these structures so you can figure out like what actions do I need to take to be a part of the social environment and act smoothly within it. And yes, as a cognitive scientist, I work on asking, well, how do humans do this? Because if we can figure that out, we're going to get, I mean, there's no better system right now than humans at doing these things. And there's a pretty good answer to this question where I'm going to be calling in this talk the mentalistic stands. You've probably heard, if you've heard any of these terms, theory of mind, mentalizing, inverse planning, inverse reinforcement learning, you can think of them as being equivalent for the purpose of this talk. So whenever I say the mentalistic stance, I'm meaning any of these things. They have subtle differences, but we can talk about it if anyone is interested. But just so we're on the same page, the idea is that when you're in Grand Central and you're navigating a space like this, when you take the mentalistic stance, it's basically saying, I'm going to analyze every agent here. I'm going to analyze by assuming it has some kind of mind. So the idea is like you build a model like this one where you say, well, every person has some kind of world model, right? So they're representing their environment, they're representing the people around it, and they have some kind of reward function. There might be something like get to the train or exit the train station, and those things create some policy through some kind of planning, and then what you're watching is just the policy execution. And if you have this kind of model that you're building of each person, then figuring out what's going on and explaining their behavior basically means you're seeing their actions, which are kind of a policy trace. So from there, you can kind of work backwards and figure out under which world model and reward function would a person be behaving this way. And the short version is, I'm not going to talk too much about this. It works really well. I think this has been one of the major successes in computational cognitive science in the last 20 years. A lot of it done by people and some people in this room. And this is also what I spend a lot of my time working on. So that's the basic idea of the mentalistic stance. You assume that people's behavior is caused by their minds, right? So it's a causal model of mental states. The main claim I want to talk about today is that I think in humans, this is actually an incomplete picture. I think there's a second social system that humans are using all of the time and that we've just been ignoring in cognitive science, but I think it has some lessons for machine social intelligence. And I'm going to call the second system an institutional stance, where the idea is that when you take an institutional stance, you try to analyze an agent's behavior, not through a causal model of world model reward functions, but you try to analyze it in terms of this kind of roles and norms and interaction policies and responsibilities. So before I tell you what that means, first, I just want to convince you that if you just try to say, let's just take this kind of inverse planning framework everywhere, I think it's not going to work. And I'm going to do it through some thought experiments. So imagine that You're in an office building, and let's call them Anna and John. And Anna is working in a glass office, and right outside is another desk where John is working. And suddenly, imagine that you watch Anna get up. She opens her office door and she says, "Hey, can you go feed my parking meter and get me a muffin?" And John immediately says, "Oh, I'm on it." And he jumps out of his desk and he runs out of the building. And you say, okay, what happened? If you interpret this through kind of the mentalistic stance, you can say, well, okay, her desires or reward function are clearly to avoid a parking ticket and to have some kind of snack. And the relevant part of her beliefs for this interaction is that she believes that if she just says what she wants to John, it's going to happen. And then for John, you can explain by saying, well, John has this kind of recursive desire. His desire is to fulfill Anna's desires. And the relevant part in this introduction of the world model is that he believes that he'll be able to fulfill Anna's desire by just doing whatever she says. And if you look at this, actually works. This is a totally valid interpretation. It's just based on beliefs and desires. So suppose we say, okay, that's our representation. But now imagine that it's, say, Sunday evening, and Anna goes to the movies. And then suddenly she turns around and she sees John a few rows back and waves at him. It's like, "Hey, John, could you go feed my parking meter and get me some popcorn?" And yeah, hopefully you agree that this would be a little bit weird, even though it's totally consistent with the rewards and world model that we just attributed. And I think it's because what's happening is that in the workplace, we weren't interpreting the actions as really revealing their underlying beliefs and desires. It was revealing this kind of role-based system that they were playing, that they were acting under. Here's another example. So imagine that you have a person, let's just, I don't know, call her Karen, and she comes up to a place and to an employee and says, "Hey, I have a complaint about one of your employees." And this employee is like, "Oh no, I'm so sorry." But then suddenly there's a phone call that says, "I'm sorry, I need to take this call." This person disappears and then never comes back. Actually, a minute later, a totally new person comes in and says, "Hey, tell me what happened with this employee complaint that you have." And so this feels totally natural and expected. Like we would have no problem doing this. But if you think about it, I did something weird. I just switched one agent for another. And if you're doing a mentalistic stance, that should feel very weird. You can contrast it with this example. So here's one where imagine that they're actually friends. And the person's saying like, "Oh, you won't believe what Eric did to me the other day." They're talking about some mutual friend. Then he gets a call and is like, "I'm so sorry, I have a call. I'll be right back in 1 minute." And then suddenly a totally new person comes in and says, "Okay, so tell me about like that story about Eric." Right? Like this would feel very weird. And intuitively, it's because the case in the bottom, you're analyzing it under mental states, and minds can't change across agents. But the one at the top, you're analyzing under roles, and roles can be occupied by different agents. So here, what you're realizing is just that there's some kind of agent, there's some kind of role, and it just gets swapped. So I think these are two examples where what we're doing to understand what's going on is not exactly taking a mentalistic stance, but we're trying to analyze into this other kind of system. And I think that's what's happening, not just in these two cases. I think we do it all the time. Some role in these cases where I think a lot of the representations that these agents are using are not necessarily trying to constantly figure out what is the other person's beliefs and desires. And you're trying to track what is each person's roles and responsibilities and making sure that everyone is actually executing the role that they have. And I also think that we are very far from being the only creatures doing this. I think this is a very prominent kind of cognitive system that appears throughout the animal kingdom. And if you think about it, I think that makes sense because we seem to be the only creature that's able to build these very nuanced predictive models of other people's minds. But there's so many species that have very rich and complicated social lives. So they have to be using other kinds of representations to this kind of social intelligence. And I think they kind of co-evolve to this feedback loop. So the basic idea is that once you're living in a group, you want to have like the mentalistic stance, which is what we mostly work on in cognitive science, is to build predictive models of unconstrained behavior, right? So you want to say, whenever someone's acting in any unexpected way, I want to build a model of what's happening in your mind so I can reason about it and predict about it and know how to interact. But sometimes your theory of mind might just not be that good, particularly if you're not a human. And there's going to be cases where you just can't make sense of someone's behavior. And in that case, you're basically trying to have another system of saying like, well, if we can't understand each other, let's just agree on some basic interaction rules that are going to allow us to make our behavior interpretable to one another without being able to have access to mental states. And you can think of this as having 3 representational stages. The very first one I'm going to call a proto-institutional representation. And the idea is basically that, imagine that I'm some kind of creature that doesn't have a theory of mind, and I want to coexist with another creature, and we just have a lot of trouble. We just don't have a very good human-like theory of mind or ability to think up to build models of each other's minds, but we want to coexist. So the simplest thing that we might do is something like saying, okay, let's just make an agreement. Whenever the two of us are around, I'm just going to do whatever I want, and I'm going to pretend kind of like you don't exist, and you're just going to get out of the way. And that's kind of a very simple way in which at least we can figure out how to coexist in some way without really understanding each other's behavior very well. And you extend that, you might think that it starts to look a little bit like the origins of a dominance hierarchy, right? So it might look something like this. If you have three agents, the three of them can just basically decide like, oh, the blue one just gets to do whatever they want when they're around. But in this case, brown gets to do whatever they want whenever green is around. This kind of getting out of the way. I'm calling them proto-institutional because to do this, you need to have some kind of rules of knowing how you're supposed to interact with each agent. But you don't need to have any kind of abstract understanding of what's going on, right? You can just basically say, oh, this is the person that does whatever they want, and I just get out of the way, but I don't have any abstract representations here. And if you look at this, it seems like these are kind of the types of solutions that insects use a lot, like bees. If you think about bees, they have this very clear, they live in these complex societies, but they have very clear roles, like cleaning, carrying food, protecting the hive, or collecting pollen, and they're all very rigid and determined. Same for ants, they're classically divided into queens, workers, and soldiers. And they all seem to have like very clear roles, and they have these rules of how to interact with one another. And they can just basically do really complicated stuff without necessarily having to accept that or believe that they have predictive models of each other's minds. But I don't think this is limited to just insects. I think that it just traces across species. So for instance, in monkeys, like female macaques, but not just macaques, there's a female dominance hierarchy that's called a matrilineal rank. And what's interesting about it is it's just static. It doesn't change, and it doesn't have to do anything with your strength or anything at all. There's basically every colony has just a rank, and if you're the top female monkey, you just do whatever you want. No one ever even seems to consider the possibility that they might be able to change the roles. There's a little bit of conflict, but in general, they tend to be pretty stable. So you might ask, like, that's kind of the simplest representation, but then at some point, you can get a slightly more abstract representation, which I'm going to call an abstract institutional representation. So the idea is, this is the same system, but now you're representing the roles and who's occupying them. So now you have a concept saying like, there's something as being kind of like the top person in the hierarchy, and this is the member that's occupying it. And what that allows you to do is to basically imagine alternative worlds, right? If you're the green agent, you might say, well, I'm in this system, but I don't like the system. So wouldn't it be cool if I were up here? And again, that seems to be the case in many creatures. So in male monkeys, there's a dominance hierarchy that's very dynamic, right? So there's a rank, but they're constantly fighting to figure out like who wants to get on top, at the very top. If you think about it, this also imposes a memory demand, right? Because now you constantly need to be tracking, wait, who's in each role? So you might expect that this means that you also need to have very good memory about tracking social roles. And it turns out that this might be the case. So there's this amazing book by Seyfarth and Cheney called Baboon Metaphysics that basically makes this point that it seems that baboons have this kind of very specialized social knowledge of roles, and they're very good at keeping track when the roles are switching. So they have like very good memory of the role switch. But it's, again, it seems to be a little bit spread across species. So there's these amazing studies on that it seems that lions hunt through a role-based structure. So when they go hunting, they basically take these different roles where there's two that are trying to kind of chase the prey and two that are trying to go around to kind of intercept it. And this is not just running because these need to take a little bit of a lead. And what's kind of interesting is that there's some evidence that the lions know that you need these roles for hunting. And when one role is missing, they will occupy it. So they check which roles are missing and they take those. They also do some role specialization. So over time, lions like taking certain roles better than others. And that actually leads them to be more successful, but they still realize when a role is missing and they'll take it. And then they can start to get kind of wild. My favorite case is the case of there's these high chimpanzees. If any of you have heard of them, they're kind of infamous for hunting other monkeys. And the way they do it is through this kind of system. So here's the idea. Suppose that it's a forest. Here's the monkey that they want to hunt. And what they do is they basically take the structure where there's one chimpanzee that's going to be that I'm going to call the driver. And the driver is basically the one that the monkey is thinking is the hunter, but the driver is actually not really trying to catch the monkey, just trying to guide it. And then you might say, well, if the monkey runs down, that's a problem. So you have monkeys, chimpanzees in the bottom that are called the chasers, and the chasers are basically preventing the monkey from climbing down so you can keep looking at it, or they will climb up to try to get it to move. Then there's other chimpanzees that will run ahead, and they're called the blockers, and the blockers will try to basically help the driver constrain the behavior. And when you have a structure like this, you can see that then it starts to get easier to predict where the monkey's going to move, right? So basically, if you can predict the monkey's behavior, you constrain it enough to the point that you can make it predictable. And they use the structure to try to guide monkeys to cliffs and where they can hunt them. Or there's some conditions, right? But some people think that there's actually a fifth rule that when all of this happens, sometimes you can get an ambusher. And the ambusher is the one that, once it's constrained, how they can have enough predictive power to move ahead and really try to hide and ambush the monkey. But the interesting thing is that these hunts take a long time. They take hours and they're exhausting. And there's evidence that the chimpanzees will switch roles. So when the driver gets tired and climbs down, another chimpanzee will go and climb up and take the role of the driver. So it looks like as you start having this kind of like really rich, complex social life, again, something like what chimpanzees do, if you have some ability to build models of other agents, but it's not good as humans, you basically start to develop all of these role-based systems for how to interact. So you start having things like dominance hierarchies or hunting structures or caregiver kin structures. So we also know that monkeys have these rich intuitions about who's supposed to help who in kinship relations. So if you're a monkey and you have a baby and the baby's crying, the other monkeys expect the friends of the parents to help if the parent is not around. So there's all of these kind of interesting expectations. But you can imagine this is kind of a representational cost. It has two problems. One of them is you're representing all these structures. And two, they're just fixed. You're just given these structures. And at some point, I think you get to like what humans have, which I'm going to call generative institutional. So the idea is that we're not limited any longer to just saying we have 3 or 4 role-based systems that we know how to play. We basically have generative models of institutional representations. So now we don't have a preset repertoire. We can just basically invent any kind of role-based structure that we want. And I think that's what we're doing all the time. Like we can invent like really weird things that no other creature does, like reading clubs or sports or governments. In child development, which I also work on, there's a lot of argument saying like, if you look around, a lot of play is actually social. You're training your social cognition. Like a lot of pretend play is always thinking about minds. But also look around, there's so much play that we do that's kind of training social roles, like real like sports or board games. Or if you look at kids games, there's a lot of them that rely on like thinking about roles and role switching. So that's the main claim. I think there's this system that we're using. And if you take this here, you might say, well, actually, 2 problems. The first problem is, you know what to do, right? Like if you watch interact, how do you should read my behavior and saying like, oh, you're performing, you have some kind of role and you're doing that, or you should really try to be thinking about my mental and saying like, it really reflects my beliefs and desires. The second problem is, if now we have this generative model and we have infinite structures, how do you figure out what institutional structure people are going to act under? Right? So other creatures, if they have a limited repertoire, it's easier to figure out which one it is. But in this case, you might say, well, what if it's just a totally new structure that I've never seen before? So the way I'm thinking about this right now, we're thinking about this, is that I think for the first problem is a really hard one. You can imagine trying to do some joint inference and you're trying to balance them out and figure out which one has more explanatory power. But I actually think that in this case, we try to help each other and we try to broadcast when our behavior should be read by roles. I think that's actually what we do a lot when we wear things like uniforms. Like when you see someone out wearing a uniform, they're basically explicitly telling you, right now, the way I'm behaving, read my behavior through an institutional representation. Don't read it through my mental states. You can contrast, for instance, here you have these 2 people and they're doing almost an identical action, right? They're at a grocery store, they're picking an object, they're looking at it. But just because this person has an apron and the other one doesn't, the behavior immediately becomes different, right? Like you assume that this person likes mushrooms and has some kind of positive attitudes toward them that gives him predictive power, whereas you're not going to assume necessarily anything to her. I think he's holding bread. Like you're not going to assume that like he really is there to want to buy bread, right? Like you assume that the behavior must reflect some kind of duty that's related to his job. I also think that we do this all the time. Emailing, you might find in your email, like people will often write things like, hi, I am writing in my capacity as blah, blah, blah. And that's basically saying from the start, like, hey, this behavior that I'm doing right now, I'm executing an institutional role, so you should read it under this kind of behavior. Or, people, you can imagine that people might say something like, oh, I have to do this, but I have to fire you. Like, that sounds natural. And I think basically what they're saying is, under my mental states, I don't like this, but under the institutional representation, this is my role. Right? So I think we haven't even tried to communicate. And so now for the second question is, okay, so suppose that you want to use an institutional representation. How do you do this? So now finally I can tell you that this is what we started to work on, because we felt like if you can't do good inferences about what is the structure that people are acting under, this might not work very well. Maybe we're just on the wrong track. And so for this, my postdoc with my collaborator, Yellow Dunham, so this is Isaac Davis who's done this work, we just basically started to try to ask empirically, how good are people reading social structures? The framework is actually very simple. Like there's been a lot of work already on structured learning, and I think structured learning is basically applied social domain. So you can think of, the easiest way to think of social structure is just a mapping where agents have roles. So it's some mapping from every agent has some kind of social role or a social type, and then you have edges between them, which is basically these are kind of roles that you can occupy, and the edges are basically rules of how to interact. And if you just basically get a bunch of data which is seeing people interact, you can try to infer the underlying structure to some kind of Bayesian inference. Again, all of those of you who have worked with these kinds of models immediately, it's a pretty straightforward idea. You just need a prior and a likelihood. So for the prior, you can just basically say, well, my prior over social structures that can be decomposed into my prior over how many roles are there and how are these roles interacting. And here the only challenge is that the space of possible roles can be infinite, right? It's unconstrained. So for that, again, there's a pretty standard, this is a solved problem. So you can just use a Chinese restaurant process to have a prior over these kind of possible unlimited number of roles. And then the likelihood function looks a little bit ugly, but I'll just tell you intuitively the idea. They're saying like, once you propose a social structure and you want to figure out if it explains the data, it's just three terms. It's saying for every interaction, I want to figure out in this structured way, I'd expect this, an agent I to engage some kind of behavior. Would I expect them to produce that behavior towards this other agent J? And am I seeing the right kind of response that I would expect? So it's basically who's starting interactions, who are they interacting with, and am I seeing the expected response? And the very first test, the way we tried this is through this very, very simple experiment. So I have about 1 minute left for the Q&A, so I'll just show you this one. But the very simple example is where you have people interacting. In this case, they're asking for help with tasks. So this guy asked this guy for help and said no. Then this person asked this one and said, yes, I'll help you. I'll let you watch it for a little bit. So that's kind of the basic idea. I think it's a little bit harder when I showed them to you for the first time, but it feels like a slightly ugly test that you're just kind of watching people going to each other and asking these for help. But after that, we can just ask people, what do you think the structure is here? Like, who do you think are the bosses, or how many managers, like top managers, mid-level managers, and low-level employees are there? Here's a bunch of hierarchies. So each row you can just basically think of as like, here's a structure where you have one top boss and 4 sub-employees that all are the same level. This is an adjacency matrix where black means those two are part of the same group. And the basic thing I want to show you is that if you look at each row, ground truth in our model and then what people infer looks pretty similar. So it looks like for these inferences, just general ways in which you use structural learning might work for these kinds of things. But yeah, I can just mention, we know it's not just pairwise statistics because you can actually change the kind of interaction. So for instance, if instead of giving each other orders for work, they're inviting each other for drinks, you can, even if you have the same pairwise interactions, people will read a different social structure, right? Because you can imagine, like, if someone goes and gives someone an order and they say yes, that's evidence that they're in different clusters. But if it's an invitation for drinks, you can say, oh, they're in the same friendship group. Yeah, and basically, I'll just skip that to get to a high level idea. So the basic idea again is that I think that in humans, we've been paying a lot of attention to the mentalistic and trying to build these kinds of models. And I think that's really important. I think that's what makes us so good at interpreting just new and unconstrained behavior. But I think we have the second system that we're using a lot. So kind of ideas when you watch an agent move around, you have some kind of perceptual process. So social perception allows you to parse the behavior, the limb movements into things like what are your actions, your attention, what are you paying attention to, what your intentions and goals. And then you decide whether to figure out whether these goals are reflecting underlying mental states or they're actually representing some kinds of roles and responsibilities. And I think that has 3 lessons when we're thinking about machine social intelligence. The first one is that if we want human-like social intelligence, we don't just need to have very rich mental state representations. We also need to have generative institutional representations. So we're going to need to have this system that's also able to synthesize and infer these kind of complex social structures that people are acting under. That's going to be really important for navigating the social world. The second lesson, I think that if you're like me, I often said, you're just not going to be able to have good machine social intelligence without theory of mind or some kind of mentalizing, because you really need that. It's a prerequisite. But it might not be the case, right? I think in the same way that other creatures that just can't build very good predictive models of each other, they just solve by saying, let's just have a regulative system where we have roles that we play that just makes everything easier. I think that can be the case too, right? Because if humans are really good at reading institutional structures, if we want robots in some kind of social setting, we can just basically create social structures that people will read easily, and they can interpret machines under that stance and vice versa. But the last thing I think we need to consider is that given that we often like interpreting things in terms of institutional roles, it might be that humans might often also represent machines through institutional roles, right? So I think again, if you're like me, I would often assume that a big challenge is that if a human interacts with a robot, they're going to try to attribute beliefs and desires, and we need to make sure that that flows well. But it might be that then we just might interpret them in terms of roles. I think, for instance, that's the way I think about my Roomba. It just basically, it's playing a very specific role, and I don't necessarily need to attribute the beliefs and desires. And so if we want robots to interact well with humans, they need to also be aware that their behavior might be interpreted through roles to be able to act accordingly. Yeah, with that, I'll thank you all. And I think we hopefully have a minute or two for questions. Thank you.
We actually do have several minutes for questions because that clock is wrong.
Oh, great.
It's 11:11. Okay, anyone, any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'm wondering, how can you tell whether some behavior responds to institutional versus mental representations under like your model?
Yeah, so right now, I think that's the big challenge. Like we have the models of the social representations, the models of the institutional representations, and the question is how to combine them. I'm gonna say, I also just tried to articulate 2 extremes, but I think, oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, first, I guess people on Zoom didn't hear me. I'm just agreeing. I think the story is a little bit more complicated. I don't think it's necessarily in humans one or the other. I think we're using them both together at the same time. So I think if you don't have a good theory of mind, then the kinds of roles that you can reason about are things like, oh, you do whatever you want. But if we have mental states, we can create really complicated structure. We can say, okay, if you occupy this role, you're supposed to have these beliefs and these desires. And just at the top of my head, I'm thinking like, if you think of like someone who, once they occupy like a governmental role and they're playing like a public servant role, we have an expectation that role includes like that they should have like a belief in the integrity of the country or something like that, right? And we expect that that belief is supposed to be tied. So we can create those more complicated things. But I would love to be able to answer that question. I suspect that the answer won't be as simple as try both and see which one has a higher likelihood of exploding. And it's more of like trying to build like compositional hybrid models that have roles and mental states combined. Yeah.
I think I saw another hand raised. Or maybe not. Oh, yes.
So I have a question. It's like, how do you think the roles will emerge from the task? Do you think they should be predefined in terms of like creating a social institution, or should you like somehow understand the roles based on specific tasks? Like, how do you define the specific like discrete roles in order to do the planning?
Yeah, I missed a little bit of the first part of the question, but I think what you were asking is to make it concrete in the I can't find my mouse, but yeah, maybe if I go back, I guess like in the concept of these tasks, is there like, how do you figure out what roles exist or what kinds of interactions exist?
Yeah, or like how do you find the roles in the
Those, yeah. So the idea is like in these kinds of models, you can basically think of it as a search space, right? Like you might say, one hypothesis, there's only one role here, and everyone has the same role. But you can also say, well, maybe there's two roles. So basically what you do is you can do things like, this is at an intuitive level, like what the model is doing, saying like, okay, let's assume there's just one role and everyone is playing in that role. And you can say, okay, how well can I explain what's going on? And you might say, well, if everyone has the same role, they're just kind of like helping each other out. So you might say, yeah, sure, that has some probability of explaining, like sometimes they'll agree to help, sometimes they're busy. But then you compare, say like, okay, what if we assume there's two roles? And once you have there's two roles, there's the assignment problem, say like, okay, who occupies each role? Right, so you can think of it like that's actually a full set of hypotheses. But you might find one based on the patterns. I think in this video is like, whenever these people at the top ask for any request, everyone always says yes, but when the bottom ones ask, sometimes they get no. So you might say, well, if I put everyone in the same role, I need to explain a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise, like I can't predict why people say yes or no. But if I posit it as two roles, then I can suddenly explain why these two agents always say why people always agree to help these two, but you have some noise in the bottom, but suddenly say yes or no. So that basically gives you a higher likelihood. And then you can think, well, what if there's three roles? And then you try to subdivide them. So that's kind of the idea. It's kind of like a little bit of a search or figuring out, like proposing different ideas and then figuring out like which one actually has a high likelihood at basically explaining most of the why people are interacting the way they are. Yeah, thanks for that question.